Yeah. Hey, folks, it is March the 30th, and we're going to continue on with our lectures on industrialization and imperialism. We're going to go through a bit of this, and then when we're done, we're going to have study hall time to finish the study island. We're probably going to have a new assignment tomorrow, so make sure you finish that up for me, okay? So let me find where off. Remember those notes that we're going over? I posted these on the Google Classroom in the form of a PDF. So if you ever get lost, you miss a day, or you need help because I'm moving too fast, just open it up and you can follow along and all that stuff. So just so you know. So yeah, I thought last time we were talking about the changes where you have engineered tools, right? Like machinery powered by something other than human strength or animals. Like we're talking about steam power. Steam power is going to like totally revolutionize how things work. And steam power in many ways is very similar to how a water mill works. But instead of water pushing a turbine or a water wheel, you have steam pushing it, and it's able to push it very fast due to pressure, and it's very strong. So, I mean, it's going to really revolutionize things. A little dark there. What is this? This guy, this is a painting of a typical household. It's kind of hard to see with this lighting. You see a mother with her children. You see the father there is working his craft. He has different sets of tools. It looks like he's a woodworker. He has different saws and wood chisels and stuff like that up there. So yeah, like we talked about, a lot of people made their money in their homes. This is no surprise to you, though. When we talked about cities in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and stuff, it was very typical for people to have a shop, their home, and the place where they made their things all in the same house. They were crammed tightly together. Of course, it was very regulated too, though, due to the guild system. But we're going to see that those regulations aren't going to totally vanish. The guilds largely will go away. So, cities grew larger and more individuals gained access to commodities that only the rich could have in most of history. So that's one of the cool things about modernity, to be a modern person, is that you're able to get things that are made very skillfully all throughout the world by people that are smarter than all of us, groups of people that are smarter than all of us, putting these things together. And for a pretty cheap price, we can get these things. Whereas just generations ago, the richest people in the world couldn't do things that we can do now. No matter how much money they had, they couldn't enjoy some of the things that you can do now. Like you think about modern trends, like internet, ultra HD TV, stuff like that.
If you said TV, they probably question you on your.
Well, I'm saying it. Well, I mean, yeah, there's a detriment to these things, right? There's a detriment to these things. Like these folks here, in England, like I told you, people moved to the cities, and they started getting jobs where they were making cash, and they could spend that cash on whatever they wanted. But here's the problem. A lot of these people were either the children of serfs or they themselves were serfs, uneducated, used to generations of a lifestyle where they had their community helping them out with decisions on morality and stuff like that. Now that they're living in the city and they have money, what do they spend their money on? Well, in London, read a study when I was in grad school. During this time period, the 16, 17, 1800s, the people on average got most of their calories from sugar and alcohol. So the life expectancy of people in London, that and all the coal they were inhaling, dropped below the levels they were in the Middle Ages, like the worst part of the Middle Ages. And so people's health just went down. They were also getting tobacco and stuff. So when you think of all the health problems these people had, they didn't know any better. They didn't have education on things like their health and stuff. And these were like generations of super poor people. So they were just getting all these things that were just killing them. And because they were doing this, the orphanages were being filled up with children from these people who passed away from short lives. The poverty was really, really bad too. And we'll talk about why it was bad for so many people in a bit. But they still had a lot more money than their ancestors. Just weren't spending it that well, Economy shift from agriculture, growing food, to industry and commerce. So people are making things. We're going to see specialization. When you're in a factory, the factory that makes shoes isn't full of a bunch of experts who are expert cobblers who are all able to make a complete shoe. No. You got one person, all they do all day is just glue the heel. And they glue like 1 million heels a day. You got one person who just works the laces. They work the laces all day. One person sews this part, another person sews that part. But none of them could make a whole shoe. But you put them together, and they're all specialized in their one little task. The glue guy, the lace guy, the sewing guy, all that. We call this division of labor. Working class and middle class emerge as serfdom and slavery ends. So the working class, you can think of this as blue-collar workers. These are people who do the hand jobs. Like they're the ones who do things like, to be the janitors, the sweepers, the chimney sweeps, the people who work in factories, the bakers. The middle class are going to be what we might call the management class. They're the people somebody might be the banker, the person who's a supervisor at a factory. You're starting to see this emergence of people who have status, but it's not nobility. So they're not knights. They're not dukes and counts, though there were still some of those around. These were people who worked their way up one way or another, and they're going to keep that status. Because often if you have money, the last thing you want is your kid to grow up and be worse than you are. So they send them to good schools and make sure that they get jobs similar to themselves. We're going to see the growth of something called universal male suffrage. It's going to become normal throughout many countries. That meant suffrage is the right to vote. And so men are going to be able to vote for people in parliament and certain government positions. Remember, we're talking about Europe, but this is what's going to come over to America. Throughout a lot of American history, what happens in Europe first eventually comes to America. The same is going to be for the right for women to vote. First, it's going to happen in England. And a lot of the suffragettes, the women who fought for women's right to vote, actually went to England and learned how they did it. And then they came back to America and transplanted those ideas and a lot of those strategies, right? And so we'll talk about that in U.S. history next year. And so you're starting to see this idea of more of democratic societies starting to emerge. And this, of course, is happening in America, too. America kind of led the way on some of this stuff, like constitutional republic, the idea of having a written constitution. Most countries are going to mimic America's constitution to this day. They're going to look at ours. They're going to change it. Even the Soviet Russians, who are our sworn enemies, they took our constitution and then they added a whole bunch of rights to it. Now, you never got those rights, but they promised them to you. So let's go to the next one. Of course, it's going to be a lot of colonial warfare. And these look like British redcoats fighting, gosh, I don't know, probably pirates, probably North African pirates. I don't remember this painting. But yeah, so during this time period, like you remember, like we were talking about, like the Turks and the Ottomans, they were like Europeans were so scared of them, and on again, off again wars with these people. Well, this is where we're going to see Europe is essentially going to dominate that region, the region of people of Turkey, like the Arabia, North Africa, and stuff like that, and kind of make them into their kind of playground. So, European imperialism. So, empire has a lot of different meanings to it. You can have the Roman Empire, where you go into a place and you control it. Or we're going to see different kinds of empires that the Europeans are going to use. Sometimes imperialism is nothing more than just making sure that a country trades with you the way you want them to. Sometimes, yeah, it's pretty brutal. You go in and you install your own government. Sometimes it's where you go to another country and you just take whatever you want whenever you want to. All of these are, of course, used. Europe needed raw materials. Well, why did they need raw materials? They needed stuff. They needed stuff like flax, cotton, dyes, spices, metals, jewels, things like that for their factories. They needed new markets too. They needed places to sell their finished goods. Like when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade next year between the Caribbean and Europe and Africa, that's a good example of this. Europe loves selling and trading a lot of their finished goods like guns and glass material and clothing and tools and stuff like that for things and people. New technology and warfare will increase national imperialistic power. This is going to lead to stuff like gunboat diplomacy. Like, it's one of the reasons why China's always had a chip on their shoulder regarding the West, especially England. It's because England and a lot of Europe and Russia had such a technological advantage over China that they went in and just kind of divided the country up and did whatever they wanted to with it for a very long time, up until the end of World War II. Nationalism fueled a competitive atmosphere between countries to gain land. So if you're a European power and you see that your neighbor is going to places like Africa and Asia and they're taking over parts of the world and they're getting super rich doing it at first, it only works for a little while. Empires are very expensive to maintain. Make a lot of money getting them, but trying to hold them together is very expensive. Well, you might think the world's running out of land. Germany is going to be like this. You're going to be a new country. And they're going to be like, wow, it looks like England and France and all these other countries have gobbled up all the poorer parts of the world. And they wanted to get in a piece of that too. It's going to help destabilize things because Europe's going to divide these things. A lot of this division was made after the Napoleonic Wars. We're going to go back and talk about that in the next unit. Because we're still going to talk about the same time period, but we're going to come back and see what was happening. Nationalism fueled a competitive atmosphere between countries and land. You're going to have also, you see here, the Berlin Conference of 1884, 1885. This is after Germany is not only a new country, Germany is like the top country in the world. During this time period when Germany unifies, they had already humiliated France. They conquered France and gave it back to them and told them to behave. Their military was the best in the world. They revolutionized how we fight. Germany sent military advisors to watch our civil war and just watch how stupidly we stood up in lines and shot at each other in rows. And they're like, we're not going to do that. And they didn't. And so they started fighting like modern troops, hiding behind cover and advancing. Most of the world's military manuals, something like 75 to 80%, were written by Germans. Everybody was studying how they did things. The best colleges in the world, the best scientists and philosophers and historians during this period were in Germany. America was adopting Germans' education methods, like kindergarten. It's a German word. So Europe was super scared of them. Like, oh my gosh, these guys are super rich. They're really tough fighters, and they're smarter than us. What are we going to do? The Berlin Conference is where they decide to give them some land in Africa and set hard borders in Africa. Now, they didn't ask the Africans about that, but this is where we get modern African countries. they were made so that European countries could control them. So this is one of the products of imperialism. Something similar is going to happen in the Middle East after World War One. Christian missionaries come to spread the gospel throughout the world, however. So during this period, you're going to have all this control of Europe over all these countries. But at the same time, through non-governmental methods, you're going to have a lot of people who are genuinely concerned about the welfare about a lot of people. So you're going to see, especially from places like America, but also like England and stuff like that. And some of the Catholic countries, you're going to see missionaries go to places like Japan, where there's going to be like a massive martyrdom event we'll talk about later. A lot of them going through Africa. A lot of Africa is going to be explored during this time period. But even though you're going to have this big Christian movement, you're also going to see the idea of something called social Darwinism. And so social Darwinism isn't the same as like Darwinism when you think of as evolution. Social Darwinism is it's the type of racism that's going to fuel things like Nazis later on. We'll talk about. It's going to be where you take something called pseudoscience, right? Like fake science. And people are going to make these ideas about where some people are superior and some are inferior. And it's going to build up the idea that if people are better, they deserve to rule. And if they aren't, they deserve to serve. And so it's going to be kind of like, this is going to be the period of what you call phrenology, when people study skull shape to determine like longevity of life and intelligence. Even though we now know your skull shape has nothing to do with that, right? Unless you've got like a super deformed skull or something, I guess. Like then maybe, but that would be like an accident. So yeah, so like science is growing, medicine is getting better, but there's still a lot of things that are really way off, you know. Here, we'll do one more. All right, so here you see the current borders. So like after there we have it like 1914. So around World War One, you see all of these borders made up, but then you see our current borders. In some ways, they're similar, but a lot of these countries were just made up out of thin air. And this is just Africa. This is just Africa. And to this day, you still have a large swath of African countries made up of people who hate each other, who want nothing to do with one another. And so sometimes they have a lot of conflict, real brutal conflict. It's the same way in certain parts of South America. A lot of those borders weren't made by South Americans. And so it's the same in the Middle East. This is one of the reasons why, as we'll learn in U.S. history, it's going to be a big part of the U.S. is where we're even going to have American presidents say that countries should be able to pick who their people are made of, self-determination. Like people of similar cultures and languages and stuff should make their own countries the way they want to without having foreign countries force it on them. Because I mean, like that's only going to breed a fight. Like if you had to live with somebody who couldn't stand, you're eventually going to fight it out. Well, that's kind of what happens in the Middle East today. You have people who don't really even have any history together, and now they got to live it with one another, or they might like have hated each other for generations. You know, so same here in like Africa. So there's going to be some problems. All right, last one. Europeans dominated the politics, economies, and much of the culture in Africa and Asia. Now we're talking about the high culture, right? Like they didn't really intermingle in with like the people that they saw as kind of like the servant class, right? So countries and political boundaries were created in many countries by Europe, despite the locals' history or differences. Like the Ottoman Empire, when it falls apart after World War I, it's going to be like this. You're going to have countries made up of thin air. Colonies often stripped of natural resources. This is still a problem we see today. For example, like the Congo. Like if you remember, I told you the Dutch would go in and they would just strip mine the place for diamonds. And they would do this through slavery. Well, this kind of thing still happens today. You have countries go in, usually those private companies and stuff, and they might strip mine an area and then leave. And the locals are just like left with like ruined land or ruined overfished part of the ocean or something like that. Off the west coast of South America right now, you have people's sovereign waters where you actually have whole fleets of Chinese fishermen will come in and they will strip fish, all the fish out of that part of the ocean, ruining the ecosystem, and then take it all back home. So that's something that can still happen today. European wars often fought in their colonies. So wars weren't fought in Europe as much at this time. Instead, they fought them in the colonies, like the Opium Wars. So the Opium Wars is essentially where China had historically has had closed borders through the whole world. But they had a lot of gold and wealth and silk and all these things Europeans wanted. So the British, though, had something that they could sell, and that some Chinese people really wanted, called opium. But the Chinese emperor said, no way, don't sell that stuff here. Because opium's highly addictive. It can lead to a lot of death and poverty and stuff like that. Well, the British essentially brought their navy up and warned the Chinese that if they didn't open up their borders, that they were going to blast their cities to pieces. Well, the Chinese had no choice. They were their armies were still in the Middle Ages. Well, they had these armored battleships. And so they opened their borders to the British, who essentially sold massive amounts of drugs to these people.
Right.
You have the Boer Wars. The Boer Wars were essentially, you had European colonies who lived in Africa, and then the British told them they had to leave. They were Dutch colonies, but these were like farmers and ranchers. And these people wound up fighting a war against the British. Boxer Rebellion. This is when a lot of Chinese people were fed up with Western influence, and they're going to be led by this guy who's kind of like a cult leader, and he's going to tell them that these magic trinkets he gives them are going to make them bulletproof, and they're not. And so these guys go try to fight with their fists against armies, and they're going to get wiped out pretty quick. But before they do, they're going to do a lot of things, like whenever they find European people, they're just going to kill them. Women, children, missionaries, elderly, anybody. So it was really, really brutal event. When colonized countries do gain independence, they're often unstable. And that's true today. It's true today. You still see a lot of instability in places, like we said, that used to be colonized, like a lot of parts of Africa and Middle East, South America, and Asia and stuff like that, where the colonies used to be, colonizers might be gone, but kind of left like an unstable mess. Their old traditional monarchies and tribes and cultures are now gone. And so without those stabilizing effects of their traditional ways, and now there's nobody there to tell them what to do once they stripped all that, it's kind of left with a lot of instability. So, and that's colonization. But we will talk about some of the good stuff next time. There are some good things. It's not all bad. There are, especially when we're talking about certain quality of life things, life expectancy, and economic things. There are going to be a lot of things that the colonies do gain. So it's doom and gloom today, but it's going to be a little bit more bright and cheery next time. All right, kids, talk to you later.